this 10 minutes to present a very preliminary idea, and I really want to underline preliminary, mostly because the data on the phenomenon that I define as nuclear bordering, the decision of countries to place nuclear power plants, civilian facilities along international borders, is something that has never really been studied in greater details. The data obviously are very scant, very weak, in addition, most of the ideas that are going to be presented here are actually deriving from my direct field experience, mostly in Southeast Asia. At the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, I lead a project called the Global Nuclear Future Initiative, and we look in particular at regional nuclear cooperation in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. And the decision of researching something like nuclear bordering was inspired by the many conversations I had with people in Thailand, in Cambodia, and Laos, who are greatly concerned today about the Vietnamese nuclear program in Southeast Asia. Now, in the West, the linkage between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons is what we are mostly concerned about. But when you travel to countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, the main concern is nuclear safety. And when you ask the Thais what they are mostly afraid of is the decision of Vietnam to place a nuclear power plant along the border with Thailand, because this will increase enormously the cost for Thailand to protect and possibly to relocate the population, and these are costs that they have not necessarily budgeted for, and they don't necessarily want to support or sustain. So my presentation will try somehow to outline some of the complications of this phenomenon that is increasingly becoming popular. I also want to underline that this presentation comes from an international security point of view. So this is not a technical presentation, it's also not a legal presentation. And what I'm going to do in 8 minutes and a half now, I'll try to define nuclear bordering. I came up with this definition, but I very much look forward to the Q&A and to hear if you have better suggestions on how to define this phenomenon. I'm also going to enter in a few details about the contours, the scale of this phenomenon today. It's quite invisible, we don't talk about it, and yet, as you will see, some countries have, in fact, made nuclear bordering as one of their main policies for the expansion of their nuclear power program. And then finally, I just outline in one slide a couple of policy implications, particularly related to nuclear liability, and maybe how we need to think moving forward about nuclear liability in case of accidents. Now, if you read the literature about nuclear siting, you mostly find guidelines that were released by the International Atomic Energy Agency, INPO, in the United States, the World Nuclear Association. And nuclear siting is simply, basically, the process through which a country decides to pick the most suitable site for a nuclear power plant. And this process, obviously, is informed by a calculation of many costs. Cost that has to do, obviously, with the geology, but also the population risks. And there are a few criteria, a few technical criteria that countries have to choose, that have to follow in order to choose the proper site. For example, they need to have a reasonable proximity to fresh water for the cooling system, relative proximity to high-skilled labor, and many technical issues along the way that somehow will help them identify the best site. Of course, the safety of their population is particularly important. And in fact, in the early 50s and in the 60s, if you see, for example, the locations that was selected mostly by countries to place the nuclear power plants, they tended to be in very low population dense areas. And that was mostly to protect their population from potential release of radioactive material. There was also an exclusion zone to somehow try to protect even further the population. Now, with the sort of improvement of safety features, and maybe with our expanding understanding of nuclear technology, this is no longer one of the top priorities. It remains a very important priority, but more or less right now, we believe that with some correct, solid safety features, a nuclear power plant can reasonably be placed more or less everywhere. And in fact, you see, for example, in India, in Vietnam, the decision of these countries to place some of their nuclear power plants, in fact, very close or in proximity to communities and villages. This is also, if you talk to the Indians, this appears very clearly. There is also a perception that a nuclear power plant does generate economic prosperity. So in the case of India, for example, the decision of place a nuclear power plant in certain communities is done in order to propel economic prosperity, economic growth, more employment, and new jobs. So in a way, the situation, the relation between the urban environment and nuclear siting has been changed. I think an important thing that has to be said is that for many years we perceived nuclear siting mostly as a technical process. But right now at least 1% of the literature talks about nuclear siting also as a political and a social process. And in fact you have some studies today that suggest that in order to pick the right siting for a nuclear power plant, you also need to consider the political and social structure of the community that will accommodate the nuclear power plant. You need to look at the type of ethnicities you have, the type of political stability or instability that is in the area where you decided to place a nuclear power plant. However, all this refers mostly to domestic calculations. So the idea is a nuclear siting is a domestic issue that is managed by the government when it decides to pick a site. And there is very little reference to the international considerations that a country may have when picking a site. There is a consideration that sometimes borderlands may be more recommendable than other sites because they are sort of isolated areas. But there is actually no study that tries to map what kind of strategic considerations a state may have in placing a nuclear power plant along an international border. Now, I believe today we are also confronted, particularly in this new nuclear renaissance, if there is one, with a new phenomenon. And increasingly, you'll see some of the countries that are expanding their nuclear power program deciding to place nuclear power plants along the borders with other states. This is the definition I came up with. I believe that there is a subcategory of nuclear siting that should be considered what I call nuclear bordering. So basically the decision of a country to place a nuclear power plant along an international border in order to satisfy both domestic and geostrategic considerations. So when you decide to place a nuclear power plant along the border with another state, the domestic cost and the domestic gains are not the only calculation you have to take into consideration. There are also geopolitical considerations that go into the process. Now, in the cases that I've reviewed, and I'm just going to give you a list, I won't have time to enter into details of the case studies, but I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A. What you'll see in these cases of nuclear bordering is that the geostrategic calculations of these countries basically allow them to believe that placing a nuclear power plant along the border will enhance their geopolitical and geostrategic position vis-à-vis regional powers, possibly rivals in regions, or great powers. However, the very interesting thing, and there is one case study somehow that supports this argument, nuclear bordering is not necessarily economically profitable for the country. There was a very clear example of this involving Russia, and I'm going to talk about it. So the economic profit, the domestic profit, is not necessarily one of the main drivers. In fact, a country may forego economic profit in order to gain in terms of geostrategic status. It may decide to place a nuclear power plant along an international border, even though they sustain domestic economic cost in order to gain more strategic leverage. A couple of things about the contours and dimensions of this phenomenon, as I'll show you in the next slide. This is not a new phenomenon. However, it is a phenomenon that is occurring quite often today. We have cases of nuclear bordering also in Europe. For example, Sweden decided to place one of the nuclear power plant 20 kilometers far away from Copenhagen. So this is not a problem that we are having in emerging countries or emerging great powers. This is a phenomenon that has occurred also in Europe. However, I believe what we are witnessing today is that nuclear bordering is occurring more often today in regions that usually have territorial disputes, where you have regional organizations and regional governance that is particularly weak, where regional organizations are not necessarily able or capable to act as mediators in these territorial disputes. And usually you have it in regions where the power distribution among countries is shifting, where you usually have a country that tries to assert itself or maybe gain more visibility and more leverage. These are some recent episodes of nuclear bordering. Now, the dates here may not be the exact dates. The data are actually very difficult to be collected. So these are somehow the decisions is when the country announced the decision to build a nuclear power plant along a specific border. You have in 2008, China announcing the decision of building one of their very latest nuclear power plant only 45 miles away from the Vietnamese border. In 2008, also Russia decides to build the Baltic nuclear power plant very close to the border with Lithuania. This is actually a project that was halted in 2010, but the very interesting thing is the statement that was released by the former Prime Minister of Lithuania specifically defined that project only as a political project. He clearly said it was absolutely economically non-viable for Russia, and yet it was extremely important in terms of the political gain that Russia was hoping to get out of this project. In 2010, China decided to build another nuclear power plant along the border with DPRK, and this actually triggered massive protest by South Korea in particular. In 2013, Argentina announced that is interested in building its third nuclear power reactor along the border with Paraguay. This is actually an open diplomatic dispute. In 2014, in February 2014, the Paraguay delegation sent a letter to Amano at the IAEA urging the International Atomic Energy Agency to act as a diplomatic negotiator with Argentina. Argentina refuses to disclose any information about the plan it has to build this third nuclear reactor. And finally, in 2014, Turkey, although they're going back and forth and they haven't really made a final decision, but they announced that they are looking into a potential construction of their third nuclear power reactor along the border with Bulgaria. So I thought this example somehow suggests that there is an increasing interest of few countries, different countries somehow, to look at international borders as a viable option. Now, I've tried to come up with a few conditions and drivers that may lead this phenomenon. It appears to me there must be a sort of power asymmetry between countries. If you look at China, if you look at Russia, if you look at Argentina versus Paraguay or Turkey versus Bulgaria, there is a clear power asymmetry that is going on in the decision of one country to place their nuclear power plant on the border with the neighboring country. There is also a sort of endemic insecurity in these regions, and this goes back to my argument about territorial disputes. But the interesting part of this is that this insecurity is there, but is still manageable, managed, and constrained. If you look, for example, at South Asia, I've tried to map out where the Indian nuclear power plants, where the Pakistani nuclear power plants are, and they're all very far away from the borders with each other. And there is a reason, like when there is too much insecurity, countries do not feel comfortable to place nuclear power plants on the borders. And in my view, some of the drivers that somehow, some of the drivers and the conditions can also be that the leadership in these regions are disputed, that there is basically no structure that can somehow define what are the rules of the game here. And finally, the geopolitical cost of nuclear bordering, the tension that you generate with your neighboring country, is fewer than the gains you actually have when you decide to go for such a decision. I close with two. I just want to show you a couple of maps to give you an example of how this actually plays out. Unfortunately, I don't have a pointer, but this is basically, these are all the ongoing nuclear power projects in China. And the very last one that was just announced is here. It's in this region. Okay? This region, which is exactly 45 miles from the Vietnamese border. I'll go back maybe in the Q&A and give you more ideas about the historical context of how this came about. This is the Russia-Lithuania project, where you have Russia deciding to place a nuclear power plant in Kaliningrad, which was completely cut off from the main electric grid of Russia. Russia had, in order to sustain their project, to build massive infrastructures. But the entire idea was to build the power plant very close to Lithuania, so to reduce the incentive for Lithuania, one, to build their own nuclear power plants, and B, to connect to the European electric grid. It was a political disaster, absolutely not economically viable, and yet it's something Russia did pursue in 2008. And the final point is, here's Argentina and Paraguay. The third nuclear power plant is supposed to be established in the area of Formosa, which is in the very north part of Argentina, and is along the border with Paraguay. I'll leave it at that, and then
Thank you very much,
yeah.
Francesca.